All right, it's no surprise to you that at T-Rex Arms we appreciate Glocks. Not just handguns, but Glocks very specifically. So specifically that technically it's the logo for T-Rex Labs. Now, the reason for doing a Glock video is not so much to talk about the guns. We do that on a pretty regular basis, but to talk about the company. As you probably know, Gaston Glock passed away about 6 months ago, and we're talking about what should Glock, the company, do next. Now, the history and future of Glock, the handguns, and the platform that is this Glock pistol is something that we covered in a video about maybe about a year ago. So we'll link to that and you should check it out. But I want to talk a little bit about what the company should do next. So obviously Gaston Glock is the original inventor of this pistol and the guy who has been running the company for the last 40 plus years. And I wouldn't say with an iron fist, but I would say with a combination steel and rigid polymer fist. He's a reclusive billionaire, which is, I think it's my favorite kind, but he's also somebody who has maintained pretty tight controls on the company. He's joked that product development is done by a very small committee of one person, and he's managed it, I would say, from a financial perspective, pretty well. But he has been very touchy. He has been very closed off. And to be honest, I can't say I blame him because a bunch of his business partners have tried to take advantage of him in different ways, including hire a hitman to take him out one time. So I understand why he kind of hung on to stuff. But now that he's gone, the company has a bit of a crossroads. It'll be really interesting to see what happens next. And there's a bunch of different directions they could take, but there's really only 3 options for them that are on the table that I want to talk about. And speaking of 3 options that are on the table, let's talk about the guns for just a second. One way to look at Glock is the most innovative, most groundbreaking, most disruptive company that has ever existed in the small arms space, at least in the last 100 years or so. This right here is the pistol that they created in the early 80s. 1980 or 1981 is when the first generation Glock 17 came out. And it was so innovative that it utterly and completely changed the way that all sidearms were made by basically every other company ever since. Prior to this coming out, pretty much every gun was a single stack steel framed hammer fired pistol. And now, 40 years later, pretty much every pistol that comes out is a polymer framed, double stacked, striker fired Wonder 9. So the influence that it had on the industry cannot be overstated. But on the other hand, years and years and years later, this is what the Glocks look like. The additions to the Gen 3 line are a light rail and finger grooves. So yeah, you could make the case that Glock is simultaneously the most innovative, most groundbreaking, most influential company in the firearm space, but also the one that has done the least amount of actual groundbreaking innovation over the last 40 years. So, which direction will Glock take in the future? Will they continue to add minor features like slide serrations on the front and optical milling and get rid of the finger grooves, which they did on the Gen 5? Or are they going to go back to their roots and try to do something really, really fantastically world-changing? Technically, this looks like a Gen 5, except for the finger grooves, but technically this is a Gen 4 that we cut the slide on. These are our vertical slide serrations, T-Rex Arms specific, and then this is a cut for Trijicon RMR, which is a perfect example of how the market had already done most of the stuff that ended up on the Gen 5. So Glock could either go back to trying to be a company that thrives on innovating and driving the industry, or a company that just makes minor modifications to bring about perfection. To be perfectly honest, this Gen 3 is my favorite Glock. This is what I carry because of the dot. This is what I enjoy shooting because it just feels so good. It just feels better, mostly the trigger. To be perfectly honest, this thing finally needs cleaning, but I just prefer how it shoots to the Gen 4. Maybe it's just an emotional attachment. I bought this Gen 3 Glock 17 at a Texas gun show about 20 years ago, and it had a lot of years of hard use in a police department before that. So not only do the physical guns hold up, but the legacy of Glock and the product design has held up really well also. Now, speaking of history, it would be interesting to go back and look at some prior historical companies to figure out how they developed into the future after the founder passed away or after an interesting crossroads appeared in the market. And a good one was probably the Sam Colt Manufacturing Company. Samuel Colt was an amazing inventor, like Gaston Glock, and he was an amazing businessman, also like Gaston Glock. In the 1800s, he had a bunch of revolutionary pistol designs that are iconic and legendary today, like the Colt Dragoon or the Colt Peacemaker. And he built factories in Europe and in America, just like Gaston Glock. And he sold, I don't know that it was entirely a monopoly, but just an incredible amount of guns to an incredibly wide array of people, like Gaston Glock. In the 1900s, the Colt Manufacturing Company only grew in its capabilities and its prominence. They made guns for other people that are equally iconic, like the Tommy gun, the 1911 for the United States military, and then eventually they were the guys that built most of the M16s, the AR-15s, and developed the iconic M4. So they are a company that you would think is well positioned to just continue to shepherd all of these designs. And the 1911 and the AR-15 are great examples of weapons that have become platforms more than just individual products, like the Glock pistols themselves. But by the 1990s, things start to go downhill. There are a loss of government contracts, which affects cash flow. They need to go after the civilian market, but they've kind of offended American citizens by being pro-gun control, and there's some boycotts going on. They have allowed innovation to stagnate, but they try to do it in a real short amount of time, not enough time, and they end up with some product recalls. This is not good, so there are a bunch of different things like bankruptcies and vain restructurings that are expensive but don't help anything. They end up being bought and sold, and now, in the early 21st century, they are owned by CZ. And there's a lot of firearm companies in the past where this has happened. Over enough time, they've kind of lost their way, their direction, and they end up being cut into little pieces inside of corporate boardrooms. And unfortunately, I think that that's the sort of thing that could happen to Glock really, really easily. They're on this good trajectory right now where they've been making solid products for 40 years. They have a customer base that trusts them, and like me, will buy a new Glock every 10 to 15 years. That's my current trajectory. But there's other customers that will buy larger volumes of Glocks, police departments, agencies, even entire armies. And for a while, that's just going to continue, which means they have value, which means people will be interested in potentially buying them. And depending on who the owners of Glock are, we maybe will see them want to cash out and sell to other people. And that puts Glock on a very interesting trajectory. I believe that they're at a crossroads where they either need to go this direction or this direction. We'll talk about those directions in a second, but right now this trajectory that they're on is probably unsustainable for a long period of time. They'll keep making the Glocks, their relevance will go down, maybe their sales will go down, and corporate raiders will want to come in and buy up the company. They're a big enough company right now that firearm aficionados and hobbyists are not going to buy it. We don't know the exact size because it's privately owned, but Gaston Glock at the time of his death was worth somewhere between $1 and $1.5 billion. So that is prime mergers and acquisition territory. At this point, we don't actually know the formation of the company. Privately owned, Gaston Glock has a bunch of the shares locked up in family trusts. We're not really sure who's going to have control of those things because about 10 years ago, he divorced his wife, fired his kids, married someone 50 years younger than he was, and put her on the board. So we're just gonna have to wait and see how that shakes out. But regardless of the leadership of the company, this trajectory of continuing to make products and sell them puts them in the crosshairs of some kind of mergers and acquisitions. And then those kind of companies usually get strip mined and broken down for parts. And Glock is really easy to break down for parts. They have factories that could easily be sold to Steyr. They have the recipe for their magical polymer that would be worth a lot to H&K. They've wanted it for some time. Then there's the patents that could be sold to CZ, and then there's licensing deals. You could always license some company to make Glock under your name and sell it for other people, not have to manage all the R&D in the factories. And then, I mean, it is pretty much a cultural property at this point, so you could license Glock, the name, to toy companies, to music labels, to video game development studios, film production houses, like all kinds of people would probably like a piece of Glock, the trademarked name. And that's going to be potentially tempting for the ownership of Glock, whatever it is. But let's go back to this crossroads. We have this trajectory here, and we have things that they could do on one side or the other. The market, developing products, selling them to customers, this is a very important thing for any company to consider as they plot out the future. But there's also going to be a component which is politics and the overall landscape. Europe and Austria are less friendly to firearm ownership and small arms manufacturing factories than they used to be. That's the other reason that this particular trajectory may not be tenable. There's going to have to be a choice to go this way or that way. So if Glock just stays on the path that they're on now, which is just making the same gun over and over again, you know, more or less, I'm sure that the Gen 6 Glock could bring back the finger grooves. Some people would like that. If that's their plan, then I think that sales will slowly diminish, and they're kind of in hostile territory. The governments of Europe don't really like local firearm manufacturers as much as they like other stuff. So they really need to bring something else to the party. If this track that they're on right now is unchanging, I think that they slowly diminish over time, kind of like Colt. So they could lean real heavily into the future. And over here is really intense R&D. If they want to do what they have done in the past, was successful, namely innovation that is incredibly disruptive, shakes up the entire industry, and makes them utterly indispensable as a defense contractor, they need to lean into the future, not just finger grooves, front slide serrations, and red dot optics. I'm talking about next generation stuff. I'm talking about electrically fired caseless ammunition, electronic triggers. Maybe instead of optics mounts, you actually have that integrated holographic sight that is in video game guns. You lean into all the cyberpunk stuff, and you hire the researchers and the scientists and the developers who can do that kind of really disruptive technological research. The problem is, of course, that that is expensive and it's pretty high risk because you are hiring new engineers who focus on maybe directed energy weapons to work on stuff that you don't actually have a market for yet. Possibly, there is enough cash flow on these existing pistols to justify that sort of thing, and it's a big, big swing. It's a swing to get Glock back to where it was in the 1980s. Something that was so new, something so revolutionary that it changed the entire gun industry and bought them 40 years of almost a monopoly. But that's a pretty big risk, leaning so far into the future. The other thing that they could do, they don't want to stay on the path they're on now, is lean heavily into the past. The third thing that Glock could do is lean very heavily into their manufacturing. And there's a couple of parts to that. The main thing is they need to keep selling Glock pistols. That's where all their cash flow comes from, and it's a great legacy product. But as we've talked about before, it's not just a product, the individual pistols, it is a platform. And in some ways, the people that have the most control over the platform right now are Palmetto State Armory, Polymer 80, Shadow Systems, all the people that are making Glock pattern pistols. So what Glock could do is open up some more of their patents and basically be the guardians of the platform and open up their manufacturing facilities a little bit more so that they are more kind of the gold standard of what that is. It helps them protect their sales directly to militaries and police agencies and things like that, but it also establishes them as an important legacy manufacturer, which I think would be very important in Austria. They're not the most ancient company, but they are a very important part of Austrian manufacture And it would be good if they allowed people to come into their factories and see that, and if they documented some of the stuff that has happened in the past. They've been an innovative company, but they are in a country that doesn't appreciate arms manufacture quite as much as it once did. Beretta, I think, does a good example of this, where they are developing product, manufacturing old product, and maintaining a museum, which admittedly has 500 years of history in it, not just 40. But that is a very important part of maintaining Glock as an arms manufacturer in Europe. It's part of the reason that SIG USA is flourishing with lots of products, and SIG Sauer Germany not so much, because it's just not a cool company. If Glock were able to properly document and create a historical legacy for what it is that they're doing, I think it will be better for the platform. I think it'll be better for the company. I think it'll be better for Austria as a whole. Apart from Beretta, I can't really think of an example of this. It's something that presidents sort of do in America. When a president has served out his 4 or 8 year term, there's always a presidential library that opens up, and all of his papers, all of his stuff gets put in this presidential library, and it's a place where tourists can go, but also historians and journalists and biographers and people like that have access to these things. Glock has traditionally been a very closed company, extremely proprietary, held stuff very close to the vest. If they opened stuff up and began to document things, after all, they are a company that not only saw, but caused a massive sea change in the way that small arms are made, pistols are made and developed, etc. If they sort of opened that up, allowed people to tour their factories, set up a museum of some of their original prototypes, molds, tooling, publish some of the papers, letters, documents, patents, I think that that would be fascinating. And again, control that Glock platform a little bit. Another example of this is the Bluetooth Consortium, or Special Interest Group. There is a group of people that manage the Bluetooth spec for the 40,000 or so companies that make Bluetooth hardware and software in the electronics industry. If Glock leans into that, it better establishes their place, but it also better establishes the Glocks that they make in their factories. And they also need to do this in America, not just in Austria. They really need to open up some factory tours in America where it's convenient for me. I can go to them a little bit easier. But also that's where so many of their buyers are. They need to hire a couple of authors to write books in the German language for Austrian and European readers, but then they also need to be publishing those books in English, because American consumers are still a huge, huge part of their audience and their customer base. And this is the sort of thing that I think would help them out in the future, even if they didn't do a ton of R&D. It establishes them as a historic leader in manufacturing technology and that sort of guardian of the platform. So yeah, that's an option. So by taking control of the platform a little bit, not by grabbing hold of it, by opening it up and being the custodian, the guardian, I think will be great for that brand that they need. But then leaning into the manufacturing side as well, establishing themselves as the gold standard and documenting this stuff and opening it up, I think would be very, very useful. It's possible that that would have helped Colt. If Colt, instead of spreading themselves thin, had kind of pulled back a little bit and become the Samuel Colt Museum, become the publisher of Samuel Colt and John Moses Browning's drawings. They'd established themselves as the guardians of the 1911 platform and the AR-15 platform. I think that they probably could have avoided getting so divided, so spread out, so broken up, and then purchased. So yeah, this is a thing that I think Glock should consider. So there you have it. There's the only 2 options available for Glock, which is, 2 extremes, leaning very heavily into the future with some big technological swings, or leaning very heavily into the past and establishing themselves as a museum of firearms, technology, history, and Austrian manufacturing excellence. But of course, it's not actually that simple. There are little things they could do in between. For example, they could lean a little bit into R&D and open up just some small safe spaces that are cool right now, like PDWs. They could lean into what B&T is doing, build out some personal defense weapons. It's very similar to what they already have, but it's also something that's very hot right now. So there's a lot of stuff they could do, partially this way, partially that way, but I do think that continuing on exactly the way that things have been is probably not the way to go. But I'm very curious to know what you guys think. What is it that would keep you interested in what Glock is doing? Like, I'm gonna keep being a Glock user, and I'm probably gonna keep being a Glock customer every, 10 or 15 years or so, and I'm gonna keep carrying and enjoying the guns that I have, and I'm gonna keep enjoying shooting the old ones that have maybe not the most advanced features, but still have tremendous capability and value. So I'm curious to know what you guys think would be interesting, but also just sort of the way that things need to go into the future. Glock could just go away, and I think that it would be fine. All the work that they've done exists. The Glock platform is well established, is being carried by a number of decentralized companies, but Glock, the company, even now, is kind of boring, but it still is greater than the sum of its parts. So to break it up into parts and sell them off, I think we would lose something. Hopefully you enjoyed that video talking about company direction, which is interesting, but in some ways I find it more boring than the guns themselves. I actually find the engineering of the Glock pistols and the way that they affected the market to be incredibly fascinating. And part of the reason that I want Glock to establish themselves as a publishing house and a museum that protects this legacy is, just selfish. I want to know more about how it happened. And I also don't want to give the impression that all of the recent additions to Glock are merely cosmetic, because Gen 5 has some cool stuff. Ambidextrous controls, the ergonomics and magwell are genuinely better. So kudos to them for that. I do complain about it sometimes because it feels like most of the changes are just dimensional to make the holster maker's life harder. But maybe that's just because I'm a perfectionist and I want everything to feel perfect.